I stood under the 5-ton weight of my Ford F-150, the sharp, stinging smell of old grease and hydraulic fluid filling my lungs, while my mechanic, Arlo, stared at my brake lines like he'd just found a dead body. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, were shaking so hard the beam of his flashlight flickered against the chassis. He didn't look at me. He just swallowed hard, the sound audible over the rhythmic drip of oil hitting a metal pan. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice cracking in the cold, drafty air of the bay. "You didn't just have a mechanical failure. Look at the primary lines, right above the bracket." I leaned in, my heart doing a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I've spent 20 years in logistics. I know what road debris does to a vehicle. I know what wear and tear looks like. This wasn't that. The steel-braided lines hadn't snapped from pressure, and they hadn't been frayed by gravel. They were notched with a fine-tooth saw, cut clean through, leaving only a sliver of metal holding the entire system together. It was designed to fail the moment I put real weight on the pedal. But that wasn't the part that made the world tilt. Arlo reached up into a hidden recess near the fuel tank and pulled out a small black plastic box. It was magnetically attached, tucked away where no routine inspection would ever find it. He set it on his grease-stained workbench and pulled out his diagnostic tablet. "It's a real-time GPS relay," Arlo said, his face the color of unbaked dough. "It has a cellular uplink. But look at the registration frequency, Thomas." He turned the screen toward me. My eyes blurred for a second before the text snapped into focus. The device was synced to a cloud account registered under a familiar email address. Elena V88. That was my wife's private account. The woman who, only 45 minutes ago, had kissed me on the cheek and told me how much she loved the way I provided for this family. The woman who had insisted 3 times that I take the mountain route through Devil's Pass today because she had a special order waiting at a boutique in the valley. I stood there in the shadows of the garage, the clicking of a cooling engine sounding like a countdown, and realized that I was already a dead man in my wife's mind. She wasn't just tracking my location, she was waiting for the dot on her screen to stop moving at the sharpest curve of a 300-foot cliff. Before I continue and show you how a man survives when his own home becomes a battlefield, I want to offer a gentle reminder. Some elements of this story have been altered for narrative and educational purposes. Any similarities to real people or locations are coincidental, but the truth behind the message is meant to help you stay vigilant. Real betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through a notched brake line. My name is Thomas. I'm 48 years old, and I've spent my life building a logistics company from a single van to a fleet of 20 trucks. I'm a man who believes in the integrity of the machine. If you take care of it, it takes care of you. I thought I had built my marriage with the same philosophy. Elena and I had been together for 15 years. She was the executive grace to my blue-collar grit. We had the house with the wraparound porch, the retirement accounts, and a life that looked like a success story to everyone on the outside. But the last 6 months had been quiet, a cold, heavy kind of quiet. Elena had started talking more about the future, not our future, but the logistics of the estate. She'd brought home a new life insurance policy, claiming my travel for work was getting too risky. I signed it because I trusted her. It was for $5 million. I didn't think twice about it. I was too busy keeping the trucks on the road to notice the person at my own dinner table was measuring me for a casket. This morning had started with a strange softness. Elena had made my favorite breakfast. She'd even straightened my collar, her fingers lingering on my neck in a way that I now realize was a lingering goodbye. "The pass is beautiful this time of year, Thomas," she'd said, her voice like silk. "The fog clears early. Just watch those turns. You know how the truck gets when it's loaded down." I'd laughed it off. I'd noticed a slight grinding noise when I backed out of the driveway, a tiny protest from the rear axle. I figured I'd stop at Arlo's on the way, just to be safe. That grinding noise was the only reason I wasn't currently at the bottom of the Devil's Washout River. Arlo tapped the tablet again. "Thomas, there's a microphone on this thing. It's a live feed. If we talk, she hears us. If we call the cops from here, she knows." I felt a white-hot rage begin to replace the ice in my veins, but I forced it down. "I'm a dispatcher by trade. I know how to manage a crisis." I grabbed a piece of scrap paper from Arlo's desk and wrote in heavy, jagged block letters, "Keep the hammer going. Do not speak." Arlo nodded, understanding immediately. He picked up a heavy mallet and began rhythmically banging on a spare metal rim, creating the chaotic, echoing din of a busy repair shop. The noise was a shield. I retreated to the back office where the thick glass muffled the sound of the shop. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone. My first instinct was to call Elena, to scream at her, to ask her how much my life was actually worth to her. Was it the $5 million? Was it the company? Or was it the man I'd seen her talking to in the park 3 weeks ago? My business partner, Victor? Victor had been my best friend since high school. He handled the contracts while I handled the fleet. Lately, he'd been pushing me to sell my shares. He'd said I looked tired, that I needed to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Now, I realized the fruit they were planning to enjoy was my funeral. I didn't call Elena. I called the one person I knew I could trust, Sheriff Miller, an old friend who had seen the worst of this county. "Miller," I whispered, the sound of Arlo's hammering vibrating through the walls. "It's Thomas Vance. I'm at Arlo's garage. My brake lines were cut, and there's a tracker on my truck linked to my wife's phone. I need you here." But Miller, no sirens. If a cruiser pulls in here, she'll know she missed. I need to be a ghost today. "I'm on my way, Tom," Miller said, his voice dropping into that low, professional tone. "Give me 10 minutes. Stay in the office. Don't touch the truck." I hung up and sat on a plastic crate, putting my head in my hands. The smell of the garage, the oil, the rubber, the rust, it all felt like an accusation. How could I have been so blind? I had spent 20 years reading maps, anticipating road hazards, and calculating fuel weights, yet I couldn't see a saw blade under my own roof. I looked at my phone. I had a shared location app with Elena. I opened it. Her icon was at our house, steady, stationary. I could almost see her, sitting at the kitchen island, her designer watch ticking on her wrist, her eyes fixed on the little blue dot that was my truck. She was probably wondering why the dot had stopped at Arlo's. She was probably rehearsing her grief speech for the neighbors. 10 minutes later, a dusty, unmarked SUV pulled into the back lot of the garage. Sheriff Miller stepped out, dressed in plain clothes. He walked into the bay, nodding at Arlo, who was still hammering away like a man possessed. I met Miller in the shadows behind a stack of weathered tires. I led him under the lift. I showed him the clean notches in the steel lines. I showed him the black box on the bench. Miller leaned in close, his jaw tight. "This isn't a domestic dispute anymore, Tom. This is premeditated attempted murder. If you had hit that pass, there wouldn't have been enough left of the truck to find these notches. It would have looked like a tragic accident caused by high speed." "She's listening, Miller," I whispered, pointing to the tracker. Miller looked at the device, then back at me. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "If she wants to listen, let's give her something worth hearing." He turned to Arlo. "Arlo, do you still have that scrap heap F-150 in the back? The one with the smashed front end from the logging accident last month?" Arlo stopped hammering, a slow grin matching the sheriff's. "The black one?" "Yeah. It's under a tarp in the yard. Frame is identical to Thomas's." "Good," Miller said. He looked at me. "Tom, here's what we're going to do. We're going to move your truck into the closed paint booth. We're going to put that tracker on the scrap heap truck and tow it out to the gorge. We'll stage the scene. Paramedics, body bags, the whole 9 yards. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "You want me to play dead?" "I want her to think she won," Miller said, his eyes hard as flint. "I want her to feel the weight of that $5 million in her hand. Because when people think they've won, they get loud, they get careless. and they start talking to their accomplices. I looked at the notched brake lines one last time. This morning I was a husband, a business owner, a man with a future. Now I was a spectator to my own demise. "Do it," I said. Arlo moved with surprising speed. He lowered my truck and pushed it into the dark, soundproofed paint booth at the back of the shop. Then, using a forklift, he dragged the mangled scrap truck into the bay. It was crushed. The metal twisted in a way that looked violent and final. He slapped the GPS tracker onto the rusted frame. Miller picked up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I'm off duty, but I've just come across a major 10 to 50 out on Blackwood Pass. Heavy-duty pickup through the guardrail. Looks like a total loss. Send fire and rescue and notify the coroner. It's a recovery, not a rescue." I stood in the darkness of the paint booth, watching through a crack in the door as the tow truck arrived to take the body to the gorge. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Elena. "Hey, honey, did you get to the valley yet? That perfume is really important to me. Love you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just watched the blue dot on my own phone, the one now attached to a pile of scrap metal, begin its slow, final journey toward the bridge. The air in the garage grew still. The hammering had stopped. The only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the building. "She's moving," Arlo whispered, looking at his tablet. "She just left the house. She's heading toward the pass." I gripped my hands into fists, the grease under my fingernails, a reminder of the work I'd done to build a life she was currently trying to bury. "Let her go," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I want her to see the fire. I want her to see exactly what she tried to do to me." I wasn't Thomas the provider anymore. I was the ghost in the machine, and the haunting was about to begin. The air in the motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the kind of industrial lavender that was meant to mask a decade of cheap lives passing through. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the blue light of my old tablet reflecting off my glasses, making my eyes look like those of a stranger. Outside, a neon sign for the Cedar Ridge Inn buzzed and flickered, casting a rhythmic, sickly red glow across the peeling wallpaper. I was Thomas Vance, the man who owned 20 trucks and a $5 million estate. But tonight, I was just a ghost in a $15 blazer, hiding in a room that didn't even have a deadbolt that worked. Before I revealed the sickening footage I saw on my screen that night, the moment I realized my best friend wasn't just a partner in business, but a partner in my murder, I want to offer you a quick heads up. This story deals with deep psychological betrayal. If you've ever felt like the people you trust most are the ones holding the matches to your life, this might hit close to home. Sheriff Miller had dropped me off at the motel an hour ago. "Stay off the grid, Tom," he'd warned. "If Elena or Victor see you before we have the digital trail, they'll pivot. Let them think you're at the bottom of that gorge." I opened the Home Guard app on my tablet. It was the security system I'd installed 3 years ago. Elena always complained it was too much surveillance, but she'd never bothered to learn how it worked. She assumed that if she didn't see a camera, it wasn't there. She forgot that I'm a man of foundations. I don't just build walls, I hide the wiring. I swiped to the living room feed. My heart, the one that was supposed to have stopped beating on the mountain, gave a violent thud. The house was blazing with light. Elena was there, but she wasn't alone. Victor, my business partner, my best man, was standing in my kitchen, pouring a glass of my 30-year-old scotch. He was wearing the same suit he'd worn to our last board meeting. Elena was pacing, her phone clutched in her hand, her eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. "The dot stopped, Victor," she said, her voice high and vibrating with a terrifying kind of excitement. "It stopped right at the bridge. I heard the sirens on the police scanner app. It's done." Victor didn't smile. He just took a slow sip of the scotch and leaned against the granite countertop I'd paid cash for. "You sure about the lines? If they find the saw marks, the insurance adjuster will flag it before the coroner even signs the report." "I did exactly what you told me to do," Elena snapped, stopping her pace. I waited until he was asleep, went into the garage, and notched them right above the bracket. It took 10 minutes. He didn't hear a thing. Thomas sleeps like a log when he's exhausted from those precious trucks. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the motel nightstand, my wife. The woman who straightened my collar this morning had been under my truck at 2 a.m. with a hacksaw. "And the tracker?" Victor asked. "Still on the frame," she said, finally letting out a short, hysterical laugh. "He was so proud of that truck. He called it his fortress. I guess his fortress turned into his coffin." Victor walked over to her and wrapped his arm around her waist. It wasn't a comforting gesture between friends. It was possessive. He kissed the side of her neck, and for a second, the mask of the grieving friend I'd known for 20 years disintegrated into something predatory. "$5 million in insurance, Jules," Victor whispered, "plus the liquidation of his shares. By the time we're done with the probate court, we'll be out of this town and halfway to the coast. No more logistic, no more smelling like diesel and grease." "I just hope the performance goes well," Elena said, pulling away to look at her reflection in the darkened sunroom window. She started to pull at her hair, messing it up, rubbing her eyes until they were red. She practiced a sob, a high, keening sound that sounded so real it made the hair on my neck stand up. "How do I look? Like a widow who just lost her world?" "Perfect," Victor said, his voice dripping with admiration. "A masterpiece of grief." I sat in the dark motel room, watching my own wake being rehearsed. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. I wasn't Thomas the provider anymore. I was a man who had just seen the cracks in his own foundation, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to fix them. I wanted to let the whole structure collapse on top of them. I swiped to the archived folder. I began to download every second of that conversation to a secure cloud drive. Then I dug deeper. I accessed the logs from our shared business server, the one Victor thought I never checked. The patterns emerged like blood in water. Victor had been siphoning funds from the maintenance accounts for over a year. That's why Arlo had been complaining about late payments for spare parts. He'd been bleeding the company dry to fund his new life with Elena, and the insurance payout was the final piece of the puzzle. They needed me dead, because if I lived, the year-end audit would have sent Victor to prison. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a call from an unknown number. I answered, keeping my voice a whisper. "Vance," I said. "It's Arlo. Sheriff Miller is at the gorge. He said your wife just pulled up. She's giving the performance of a lifetime, Thomas. She's screaming, throwing herself at the paramedics. Miller says it looks so real he almost felt sorry for her." "Is Victor there?" I asked. "He pulled up 5 minutes after her. He's restraining her, telling the deputies what a great man you were. It's a circus, Tom." "Good," I said, my teeth gritted. "Arlo, I need you to do one more thing. Can you get into Victor's laptop? He keeps it in the office safe, but the code is our old high school football jersey numbers, 84-12. "I'm already there," Arlo replied. "What am I looking for?" "The contract with Vanguard Logistics. I have a feeling he's already signed a pre-agreement to sell my shares the moment I'm declared dead." There was silence on the line for a few minutes, save for the sound of Arlo's typing. "Got it," Arlo said, his voice flat with disgust. "Dated 3 weeks ago. Contingent on the untimely passing of the primary stakeholder." "Jesus, Tom, they didn't just want you dead. They wanted you erased." "They're about to find out that ghosts don't erase that easily," I said. I hung up and looked back at the screen. The house was empty now. They were both at the crash site, playing their roles. I looked at the furniture, the photos on the mantel, the life I'd spent 20 years building. It felt like looking at a stranger's museum. None of it belonged to me anymore because the person I built it for never existed. I picked up the burner phone and sent a message to Sheriff Miller. "The recording is secure. The contract is found. How long until the identification?" Miller responded instantly. "We're taking her to the morgue now. I've told her the body is too mangled for her to see, but I need her to sign the presumptive ID papers. Once she signs those, it's fraud on top of conspiracy." I sat back in the dark. I could have called her. I could have sent her a photo of me sitting in this room, watching her. I could have made her heart stop with a single text. But an architect knows that if you want a building to fall, you don't push it. You just remove the load-bearing beams and wait for gravity to do the work. I spent the rest of the night watching the clock. 2 a.m., 4 a.m. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a pale, weak light that did nothing to warm the room. I checked the house feed one last time. Elena and Victor were back. They weren't rehearsing anymore. They were in my bedroom drinking champagne, talking about which beach house they were going to buy in Malibu. "To Thomas," Victor said, raising his glass to the empty room. "The best partner a man could ask for. He did all the work, and we get all the reward." Elena laughed, a sound that made me feel like I was the one who had been notched with a saw. "He was always so predictable, Victor. He never looked down. He was always looking at the horizon." I closed the tablet. I stood up and straightened my blazer. "I'm looking at you now, Elena," I whispered to the empty motel room. "And I'm the last thing you're ever going to see coming." I walked out of the motel room and headed toward the police station. The final mile was ahead, and I was going to be the one behind the wheel this time. The morning air tasted like iron and cold exhaust. As I stood in the service corridor of my own headquarters, I was wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit Arlo had given me, a baseball cap pulled low over my eyes. To the janitors and the early shift drivers passing by, I was just another contractor coming to fix a leak. They didn't see the man who built the glass tower they were standing in. They didn't see the man who was currently listed as a presumptive fatality on the county dispatch logs. I reached the door to my private office, the inner sanctum where I had closed million-dollar deals and planned the expansion that had made us the biggest player in the region. I didn't enter through the front. I used the maintenance access panel I'd had installed during the build, a secret way to access the wiring for the sound system and the security feeds. I sat in the narrow, dark space behind the bookshelves, surrounded by the hum of servers and the faint smell of dust. This was my vantage point. This was where I would watch the load-bearing walls of their lie finally buckle. Before I show you the moment Elena and Victor walked into the trap, the moment they realized the ghost wasn't in their heads, but in the room, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been so close to a secret that you could feel it vibrating in your teeth? Have you ever had to stay silent while people sat in your chair and planned to sell your soul? I'm reading every one of your comments, and your stories are the fuel that keeps this channel moving. At 9 a.m., sharp, the elevator chimed. I watched the monitor in my lap. Elena and Victor walked into the reception area. They were a study in performative tragedy. Elena was wearing a black silk dress, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She held a lace handkerchief to her nose, her shoulders trembling with a practiced rhythmic sob. Victor was right beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, his expression a mask of grim, stoic support. "We're here for the emergency board meeting," Victor told the receptionist, his voice echoing with a hollow, booming authority. "And to meet with the estate attorney. It's a difficult day, but the business must continue. Thomas would have wanted it that way." The receptionist, a girl named Sarah, who had worked for me for 5 years, looked like she'd been crying for real. She nodded, unable to speak, and gestured toward my office door. I watched them enter my space, my office. The moment the door clicked shut, the transformation was instantaneous. Elena pulled off the sunglasses and tossed them onto my mahogany desk. She didn't look like a grieving widow anymore. Her eyes were sharp, bright, and predatory. She walked to the window, looking out over the fleet of trucks parked in the yard. "My trucks. God, I hate this office," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "It smells like old leather and stale coffee. How long until the Vanguard reps get here, Victor? I want to sign the papers and get out of this town." Victor sat in my leather chair, the one my father had given me when I bought my first rig. He leaned back, putting his polished shoes up on the desk. 10 minutes. The lawyer is bringing the limited power of attorney for the liquidation. Since you signed the presumptive ID at the morgue this morning, the state has cleared the path for the emergency transfer. The insurance company has already moved the first $2 million into the holding account. He pulled a cigar from the humidor on my desk, the one I saved for successful audits, and snipped the end. We did it, Jules. No more mountain passes. No more grease-stained checkbooks. Just the sun and the sand. I still can't believe Arlo didn't suspect a thing, Elena said, sitting on the edge of the desk, swinging her leg. He looked so pathetic at the garage yesterday. He actually apologized for not catching the noise sooner. Victor laughed, a dark, jagged sound. Arlo is a parts changer, not a detective. He saw a smashed truck and a grieving wife and did exactly what he was told. Men like him and Thomas, they're built for the work, not the win. They're the bricks, Elena. We're the architects. I gripped the tablet in the darkness of the crawl space. The bricks. They thought I was just a component of their lifestyle, a piece of material to be used and discarded. It was time to start the haunting. I tapped a command into the office's smart control system. In the office, the lights flickered once, then twice. The temperature, which had been set to a comfortable 72, began to plummet. I dragged the slider down to 55. What was that? Elena asked, rubbing her arms. Victor, is the AC acting up again? It's freezing. The building is old, Victor muttered, though he sat up slightly, taking his feet off the desk. I'll have maintenance look at it after we sign. I clicked another icon, the sound system. I didn't play music, I didn't play a voice. I played a sound that I knew would trigger Victor's muscle memory. It was the low, rhythmic click, click, click of the rear axle of my truck, the exact sound that had led me to Arlo's shop yesterday. The sound bled through the hidden speakers in the ceiling, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the room with a metallic, mechanical tapping. Victor froze. He recognized it. I saw the cigar shake in his fingers. What the hell is that? It sounds like a clock, Elena whispered, her face going pale. No, Victor said, standing up. That's not a clock. That's the axle. That's the noise from Thomas's truck. That's impossible, she hissed. The truck is at the bottom of the gorge. It's a pile of scrap metal. I increased the volume. The clicking became a roar, a violent, snapping sound that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the office. Then I triggered the monitors on the wall, the 4 screens I usually use to track fuel costs and driver routes. They didn't show data, they showed the GPS tracker app. The screen was filled with a map of the Devil's Pass. In the center was a bright blue dot. It wasn't stationary at the bottom of the gorge. It was moving. It was racing along the mountain road, heading directly toward the coordinates of our office. Victor! Elena shrieked, pointing at the screen. Look at the tracker. How is it moving? The truck is gone. Victor scrambled for the remote on the desk, his face slick with sweat. It's a glitch. It's the cellular uplink. Arlo must have left the device on the tow truck or something. He pounded the buttons on the remote, but I had already locked the inputs. The screens wouldn't change. The blue dot continued its relentless march toward the center of the city. Then I opened the intercom line. I didn't use my voice. I used the recording I'd taken from the house cameras the night before, the one Arlo and I had archived at the motel. I did exactly what you told me to do. Elena's voice boomed through the office speakers, distorted and heavy. I waited until he was asleep, went into the garage, notched them right above the bracket. Elena fell back against the window, her hands over her ears. Stop it! Victor, make it stop! Who's doing this? Victor was frantic now, pulling at the wires behind the desk, trying to cut the power. Someone hacked the system. It's Arlo. It has to be Arlo. Thomas sleeps like a log when he's exhausted. The recording continued, echoing off the glass walls. I guess his fortress turned into his coffin. Thomas? Victor yelled at the empty room. "Thomas, if you're alive, come out and face me. Stop playing these games." The door to the office didn't open. Instead, the phone on the desk began to ring. The caller ID showed a single word, Thomas. I watched them on the monitor. Elena was huddled on the floor, sobbing for real now, not for the cameras, but out of a primal, bone-deep terror. Victor was standing in the center of the room, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. The phone kept ringing. Ring, ring, ring. Victor finally reached out, his hand shaking, and hit the speaker button. The clicking of the axle stopped. The recording went silent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Victor?" I said. My voice was low, calm, and carried through the room with a weight that seemed to crush the air out of their lungs. I wasn't using the intercom now. I was standing in the doorway behind them. They both spun around. I was standing there in Arlo's jumpsuit, the cap pulled off, the grease from the garage still on my forehead. I didn't look like a ghost. I looked like a man who had spent 20 years building a foundation and was now ready to watch the roof come down. "Thomas?" Elena whispered, her voice a thin, broken thread. You were in the truck. I saw the sirens. I saw the body bag." "You saw what Sheriff Miller wanted you to see, Elena," I said, stepping into the room. I walked to my desk and picked up the cigar Victor had dropped. I snuffed it out in the crystal ashtray. "And Victor? Arlo isn't just a parts changer. He's the man who found the hacksaw marks. He's the man who saved my life while you were busy measuring me for a grave." Victor tried to lung for the door, but Arlo was already there, his massive frame blocking the exit. Behind him was Sheriff Miller and 3 deputies. "Sit down, Victor," Miller said, his hand on his holster. "We have a lot to talk about, starting with the $5 million in insurance fraud you just committed by signing that presumptive ID." "It was her," Victor pointed a trembling finger at Elena. "She's the one who cut the lines. She came to me. She said she wanted him gone." "You coward!" Elena shrieked, lunging at Victor, her nails digging into his face. "It was your plan. You needed the money to cover the embezzlement. You told me exactly where to notch the steel." They were tearing each other apart on the floor of my office, the 2 architects of my demise, reduced to 2 rats in a flooding basement. I watched them for a long moment, feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace. The betrayal was complete, but so was the demolition. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," Elena cried, looking up at me from the floor, her makeup ruined. "He manipulated me. I love you. I was just confused." I looked at the woman I had shared 15 years with. I looked at the face that had smiled at me while she held a saw in the dark. "I'm an architect, Elena," I said quietly. "I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a facade, and you were always just a facade, a beautiful one, but hollow." I turned to Sheriff Miller. "The digital recordings are on the server. The contract for the Vanguard sale is in Victor's laptop. Everything is there. Clear the site, Miller. I'm done with this build." As the deputies led them out in handcuffs, Elena still screaming my name, Victor silent and defeated, the office finally went quiet. I walked to the window and looked out at my trucks. The sun was finally breaking through the fog over the mountains. The fleet was still there. The company was still mine. But as I looked at my desk, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the near death or the arrest. The hardest part was going to be rebuilding a life when you no longer trust the ground you're standing on. But then Arlo walked over and handed me a wrench he'd been carrying in his back pocket. "You okay, Tom?" I looked at the tool, solid, heavy, and honest. "I'm getting there, Arlo," I said. "I think I'm going to start with the foundation. This time I'm pouring the concrete myself. But there was one more thing. A final piece of the puzzle Victor had left in the safe. A document that wasn't about Vanguard or Elena or the trucks. It was a document about my father. The demolition was over, but the excavation was just beginning. The silence that followed the arrest of Victor and Elena was different from the silence of the mountain pass. That silence had been heavy with the threat of death. This one was heavy with the weight of a life that had to be completely redesigned. I sat at my mahogany desk for 3 hours after the police cruisers had disappeared. Arlo stayed with me, leaning against the doorframe, his grease-stained hands folded across his chest. He didn't say a word, and for that, I was grateful. He knew that when an architect realizes the entire structure is built on a lie, he doesn't need advice. He needs time to look at the blueprints. Before I reveal the final crushing secret I found in that office safe, a secret that changed the way I looked at my father and the very company I had spent my life building, please take a moment to subscribe to the Otis Archive. This channel is a sanctuary for the stories that the world tries to bury, and your support is the foundation that allows these truths to be told. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that your entire history was written by someone else's hand? I reached into the small floor safe Victor had used for private filings. Arlo had given me the jersey numbers, and the heavy steel door swung open with a soft, mechanical sigh. I expected to find more evidence of embezzlement, maybe more contracts with Vanguard. Instead, I found a yellowed manila folder with my father's name on it. Elias Vance. Confidential. My father had died 10 years ago. Everyone said it was a heart attack, the result of a man who worked too hard for too long. He had been the one to bring Victor into the business, treating him like the son he'd always wanted me to be. Sharper, faster, more aggressive. I opened the folder. Inside was an original partnership agreement dated 25 years ago. It wasn't the 50-50 split I had been led to believe. It was an 80-20 split in favor of my father. But tucked behind it was a series of medical bills and a legal transfer of interest, signed 3 months before my father died. The signature at the bottom, Elias Vance, was a masterpiece. To the casual observer, it looked perfect. But as a man who has spent 20 years reviewing shipping manifests and driver logs, I saw the flaw immediately. The pressure of the pen was wrong. It was too steady, too clinical. My father's hands had been shaking from the medication in his final months. Victor hadn't just stolen my life. He had stolen my father's legacy before the man was even in the ground. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. The betrayal didn't start under my truck 2 days ago. It had been the foundation of the company for a quarter of a century. Every dollar I had earned, every truck I had added to the fleet, had been built on a forgery. Arlo, I said, my voice sounding like gravel, call Sheriff Miller. Tell him we have a cold case to reopen. The next 6 months were a blur of depositions, audits, and courtroom drama that stripped the name Vance Logistics down to the studs. The trial of Victor and Elena was the lead story in the county papers for weeks. The widow who wasn't, the partner in crime. Victor tried to play the victim, claiming I was an unstable recluse who had staged the accident to frame them. But Arlo's technical report and the house camera recordings were a wall he couldn't climb. And then there was the document from the safe. The state brought in a forensic handwriting analyst. They confirmed what I already knew. Victor had forged my father's signature while he was dying in a hospice bed. That discovery didn't just add more time to Victor's sentence. It triggered a bad faith clause that allowed the state to seize every asset he had ever claimed. Victor was sentenced to 30 years for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and grand larceny. He didn't look at me as they led him out of the courtroom. He looked at the floor, the arrogant architect of my demise, finally realizing that he had built his own prison. Elena fared no better, because she had been the one to actually notch the brake lines, the physical act of the attempt. She was sentenced to 25 years. She cried during her final statement, pleading for mercy, talking about how she was confused and vulnerable. I sat in the front row, looking at her. For 15 years, I had believed that face was my home. Now, I saw it for what it was, a facade that had been painted over a hollow core. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt the cold, hard peace of an engineer who has finally removed the rot from the building. After the sentencing, I did something no one expected. I liquidated the company. I sold the fleet, the glass tower, and the contracts, not to Vanguard, but to a collective of the drivers who had worked for me for decades. I didn't want to be the king of a logistics empire anymore. I didn't want to spend my life looking at spreadsheets while people planned my funeral. I kept only two things: my father's old 1984 rig and a small piece of land near the Devil's Pass, the place where I was supposed to have died. I used the remains of my personal trust to build a small, honest workshop on that land. No smart systems, no hidden cameras, just wood, steel, and a manual lock on the door. One evening, about a year after the confrontation, Arlo pulled up to my workshop in his own truck. He'd used the reward money I'd given him to open his own independent shop downtown. He looked at the structure I was building, a simple, sturdy bridge for the hiking trail that crossed the gorge. "You building it to last, Tom?" Arlo asked, tossing me a cold bottle of water. I looked at the steel beams, the deep concrete footings, and the clear blue sky over the mountains. I didn't have $5 million in insurance anymore. I didn't have a fleet of 20 trucks, but my hands were steady, and my heart didn't ache when I breathed. "I'm building it for the truth, Arlo," I said. "And the truth is the only material that doesn't buckle under pressure." I stood on the edge of the gorge, looking down at the white water of the Devil's Washout, 300 feet below. A year ago, that was supposed to be my grave. Today, it was just a view. I realized then that the mechanic didn't just find a tracker on my truck. He found the tracker on my soul. He helped me see that I had been driving a life I didn't own for people who didn't exist. If you are listening to this, and you feel like the people you love are cutting your lines, if you feel like you're driving toward a cliff and you can't find the brakes, don't be afraid to stop. Don't be afraid to go under the lift and look at the damage. It hurts to see the notches in the steel. It's terrifying to realize the person in the passenger seat is tracking your fall. But remember this: you are the engineer. You can always walk away from the machine. You can always clear the site and start again. And sometimes the most beautiful thing you will ever build is the silence of a life that finally belongs to you. Thank you for watching this story. If it reminded you to check the foundations of your own life, then my journey was worth it. Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly value every story and every voice in this community. Don't forget to subscribe to the Otis Archive and share this video with someone who might be driving on cut lines today. Take care of yourselves, stay vigilant, and never forget who holds the saw.